I left my
It said live, so we should be live now.
Don't have to go on there, but
are we live? Yeah. But let me just read this quickly into the net account, and then we can get started. All right, so this is another round of our FX Core design reviews. So let me actually share the screen again. All right. So if folks are joining us online, please ask questions, and I will do my very best to actually answer them during the meeting. If I don't answer them, don't be upset. That's probably just me not being able to use Google Hangouts correctly. That's not necessarily a statement if I don't want to answer your question. So today we are looking at web-specific encoding APIs. As you probably know, the .NET Framework has a bunch of encoding APIs already. And if we say encoding APIs, they usually refer to UTF-8, ASCII, that sort of thing. But in the broader context of web, there's obviously other formats as well. I mean, there's JSON, there's JavaScript, and then there's obviously HTML and URLs. And so we have a proposal to take some of the APIs that the ASP.NET team was building for ASP.NET 5 and basically push them down into the BCL. By pushing down, it basically means cleaning up the dependencies, making sure it is a general purpose API that we can put in the BCL and support anywhere. Because there's really not a web-specific scenario. You can easily imagine a client application, emitting HTML and then having the need to actually do something about text that is coming from a different source to actually encode it correctly. And so Christoph should probably talk a bit to that because he was driving the whole.
So I wonder whether you should not start first, like what prompted ASP.NET to create the API.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
I can talk a bit about like what changes I made, because for the background, Levi created lots of these APIs, and I just tweaked some of the surface area. I mean, majority of the work you did. So
yeah. So hi everyone. I'm Levi. I'm formerly of the ASP.NET team. I have some historical context behind these APIs. So if you recall back to the .NET 4 days, we've had APIs like HTML encode, URL encode, and so forth in System Web for a very, very long time, going all the way back to .NET 1.1. In .NET 4.0, the team actually did some work to try to extract those APIs out of System Web and put them into a more common assembly like system.dll. And the reason that that was done is because we saw a very large number of console application developers, Windows Forms developers, pulling in System Web just for these APIs. So that was the first thing that told us that these APIs are somewhat more universal, that they shouldn't be consumed just within a web application. So for ASP.NET 5, one of the things that we tried to do was we wanted to create an assembly just for these APIs, an assembly that could be consumed by anybody. As a result, we had a little bit more leeway to kind of reinvent what the API shape looked like. We tried to make it a little bit more extensible, a little bit more configurable, more DI friendly. And the .NET Core team has since picked up the work to try to reshape what those APIs might look like if they were pulled into a proper .NET owned package rather than something that was specific to the ASP.NET runtime. So that's some historical context behind all of this.
So then, did you talk about the DI? Like one of the goals for the APIs was to be DI friendly.
Okay, sure. So historically, these APIs have always been static. Whenever you wanted to do HTML encoding, you would call in System Web HTTP utility.html encode. It's just a static API. There is a config-based way to change the implementation, but with the drive to do more proper DI and the move away from a .config file, we needed to do something that was a little bit more abstract, a little bit more proper for the DI world going forward. So as a result, we've also split the APIs into concrete classes, base classes, interfaces, the things that you would expect for a DI-friendly API set.
And I mentioned that because you will see lots of the API decisions in this API set are kind of driven by the need to support DI. So the main changes that I did some cleanup. I changed abstractions from interfaces to abstract classes. And I would say the main change was to the APIs. There were a set of interfaces, and you had to kind of implement 3 different methods: one that encodes a string, one that encodes to a text writer, and one that encodes a char array. And you kind of implement them such that they behave the same way, yet the implementation was very, very different depending in which of those you were doing. And I changed it such that there's an abstraction you implement for members that are very different. They do very different things. And then the APIs to encode either char array, text writer, or a string, there are extension methods operating on top of these virtual APIs. And therefore, it's kind of probably impossible to make a mistake where, encoding a string and encoding a char array works slightly differently.
Do you think it might be useful to show the interfaces currently checked into ASP.NET 5 versus what these candidates look like, just for the contrast you were talking about?
First of all, maybe look at some sample code that you guys have, so we know how the APIs are being used.
Sure.
Like, I don't know where you will find that easily.
Well, if you go to the ASP.NET GitHub site and just look for HTML,
that's your version of it, right?
No, I sent in email. I sent you actually a link to the old APIs and new APIs. So if you find the email from,
I see. So then that should just be on the actual link that here. The resulting APIs are here. Encoding it. So these are the original APIs.
you just go, for example, to
and these guys here and these guys here, right?
Yeah.
They will be the same. They're
all the same. So this is actually exactly what Christoph was just talking about. It's an interface that has 3 different overloads of the encode routine, and the implementation is radically different for all 3 just because it has to be. One's returning a string, one's writing to a text writer. There are different optimizations, but you actually want the end result to be the same, even though the machinations are a little bit different.
You basically have to implement the same logic 3 times using very different implementation. You can imagine creating a string as an output versus writing to a text writer. The implementation will be very different.
Yeah. So to be clear, the actual mechanics on how you produce the result is encoded by the interface with the 3 different methods. And then there is the actual differences in the formats, which is encoded by the different interfaces. So there's HTML, there's URL, and there's.
But that's yet different thing that I'm talking about. For these 3, they are both, they are all 3 methods are HTML encoding.
Yep.
They have to have the same semantics, yet the implementation is very different. So
do you think we should put all these different conveniences into the interface stuff?
So that's what I was saying. So I changed it such that these 3 are kind of convenience extension methods on top of lower level abstract members.
Makes sense.
So now if you can switch to the new API.
You want to look at sample code or you want to look at the APIs?
Well, just to contrast with this one, we can quickly look at the new abstraction. And then, so if you go, is that the whole one? No.
And these guys.
Source.
One.
And now go text encoder. So as you see, there are still actually 4 members to implement, but they are all kind of lower level for different purposes. You implement them once, and then on top of this abstraction, there are extension methods that actually let you do the encoding to strings, and so on and so on.
What do these guys live?
Text encoder extensions.
So I absolutely have to write unsafe code to even.
No, it's basically if you implement a custom.
Implement it,
to implement. To use, you just call these extension methods.
I see.
So you see, this is basically
why extension methods? Couldn't they just be on the base?
They could be on the base. I can talk a bit why I made them extension methods, because I believe there will be more and more of these. and some of the existing ones may not be as long-lasting as the interface, as the abstraction. Like
But they're gonna
encoding.
ship in the same library?
Yeah.
Generally, we frown upon like having extension methods shipping with the same type of view. So
Yeah, it's something we could discuss. I don't feel feel like super strongly about them being extension methods or not. I found it a bit cleaner to kind of see, this is the abstraction, you have to implement it, and the extension methods are just helpers on top of it.
The common use case is not implementing these, right? The common use case is consuming them, and you see an extension method, and you're like, well, that's maybe not the core thing I want to call.
Also, I wonder if the sort of, so you've got these unsafe primitives that are like sort of the worker methods, and these are sort of the actual sort of 99%. I wonder, like, one other advantage, you could make some of the worker methods protected if you wanted to keep them sort of, if you want to draw people to, like, these are the entry points, and the rest is the busy work to sort of bridge the sort of implementation.
or put them on another drive type.
Additional thing that I forgot to mention is I don't feel super strongly about this either way, but ASP.NET team felt like abstractions should not have a lot of implementation. So today the abstraction is basically pure virtual class, pure abstract class.
What are these extension methods?
The moment these would end up being, like helper methods in the abstraction, it would not be pure anymore.
Sure.
What encoding do they implement?
What is it?
What encodings do these implement? Like
Which ones?
the extension methods. There's got to be some algorithm or something like.
Yeah. So if you scroll up to one of the extensions methods. So extension method takes text encoder as the first parameter, and depending if you call it on a HTML encoder, you're gonna get a HTML encoding. If you call it on JSON encoder, you're gonna have a JSON encoding.
So it is generic to every encoder then.
Correct.
It's nothing specific.
Yeah.
So I guess this isn't something that historically, at least in the .NET framework, that we have sort of like, we want abstractions to be abstract, but sort of implementation that is entirely in terms of the abstraction is not necessarily ruled out. But historically we've never ruled that out from. So I am actually curious if this
that's
is
what link is more than anything else. I mean, link is just an implementation over the abstraction of IEnumerable.
Yeah, but that was
Sure.
mostly done because we couldn't put it on the actual type because it was not an abstract.
But I
type,
just
it was
mean,
an
like,
interface.
I just want to go back to this
Connection.
point that ASP.NET wants the abstractions to be basically pure. I just want to make sure that I understand the requirement, or is it just a sort of is it a direction that we're heading?
As I said, I mean, you may argue for this a bit better. In my opinion on the subject is if the helper methods would add fields to the type, to the abstraction, I would say there's value in keeping the abstraction pure.
Right.
These
I
helpers don't add the fields, therefore I feel like we could just add them to the
If
abstraction.
you want to make it pure, why not keep it an interface then, as opposed to making it an abstract?
So you could,
No, because then you cannot evolve it.
I agree, but
then it will become impure. But it's sort of
But I propose let's do this. Let's look at the code samples,
fair.
and then we can come back to this discussion.
Yeah, so to do that, we'll put into that. Well, I hope I did this justice. If I messed something up.
No, great. You added nice formatting. Oh, actually, I just sent you a CS file. It had nice formatting too. Yeah, so this just shows first few samples, kind of basic usage of the extension methods. So as you can see, the encode methods in all three first samples, they are the extension methods. Each of the concrete encoder, each of the abstract types that represents a concrete encoding, like HTML encoder, they have a default property that returns a default implementation of the encoder. Default implementation means it's the default character set that is allowed or disallowed. Later on, there's a sample that shows how you can instantiate the default HTML encoder and actually change the number of, the ranges of characters that will be encoded.
And that default,
this is the,
sorry, Christoph, that default is hard-coded. That's not something you can inject into, right?
no, that's, yeah, exactly. So usually when you do, dependency injection, you would inject into a variable that is HTML encoder, but then the DI container would supply an implementation, and implementation may be the default one.
Yeah, got it.
This just shows that the abstraction and some of these APIs may be complex and maybe unsafe and so on, but actual usage is super straightforward. There's not that much to these APIs.
And these are just basic plays on the formats that you can have, basically just a text right at the string and then an array with the substring.
Yeah. So first 4 samples just shows the 4 extension methods. Other encoding section shows that there's more than just HTML encoder. There's URL encoder, otherwise known as percent encoder. What is it?
The comment is incorrect on the sample.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And beyond the built-in encodings, what's our expectation for what other encodings people might implement?
Sorry, I missed the question.
I was curious, beyond the HTML, URL, and JavaScript encodings that we ship, we have an extensibility mechanism. What do we expect other people to implement?
So a lot of this is based off of the anti-XSS encoder that is available on Codeplex, and they offer things like CSS encoding. I think they offer LDAP encoding. So those aren't very common to see, but you can imagine that somebody makes the appropriate implementations to do those contracts.
We imagine different versions of the URL encoder as well. I know over time that's been changing from the different implementations of the framework.
Possibly, when we did this, we tried to make it future-proof in the sense that you can configure it to allow internationalized characters, so you're not just limited to ASCII. That should cover the majority extensibility case, but it's possible that some new RFC will come out that mandates a different format. We just have no way of predicting the future. But hopefully the one that's in box will be appropriate for everybody.
And we can. There's a good chance we would be able to evolve it to, if stuff changes, add new capability to the one that's in box also, right?
Looking at the abstraction text encoder, it looks like it should be able to handle things like picking against SQL injection, where I'm not trying to change one character for another character, but I need to look at several characters in sequence.
So this isn't necessarily meant for things like SQL injection. This is meant for encoding a piece of data so that it can be represented in a response, where that response might be HTML, URL, CSS, and so forth. Things like SQL injection generally have different protection mechanisms.
But it's true that if the encoder needs to make a different decision based on context, it won't be able to do, because the abstraction just takes a Unicode scalar.
Interesting.
So it doesn't see the stream in the future.
Right.
It kind of sees the stream in the past. It can cache it. So I don't know if that's what you wanted.
You need a pointer to the thing where you start encoding, right? But you only see as far as the buffer holds the data, right?
Well, there's an API that says, tell me where I should start encoding. It sees the whole buffer, the whole stream, but it's not the main method that actually does the encoding. The actual method that does encoding just takes an int and says, give me a character that corresponds to this int Unicode scalar.
So it is actually just like I'm replacing a character for a
exactly.
So that's why it won't be applicable to.
That's it.
And Christoph, it seems like there's an assumption that these encoders never have data, that they could use them concurrently.
Yeah, now the sound is not working as good as it used to.
There's an assumption that the encoders are stateless and can be used concurrently.
Oh, okay. They are. I don't know if
Yes.
there's an assumption like this, but current implementation, it's true.
That's the assumption for ASP.NET, because the idea is that if you're taking these in via DI, they're generally singletons, so they had to be stateless.
Speaking about the code sample, somebody said, "Oh, the comment is incorrect." Well, the JavaScript code sample, I should have replaced the string that I want to encode.
Yeah, we can.
That
we
doesn't
can
make
clean
any
these
sense.
samples up.
Having said that, there's an interesting thing. The comments are actually correct because we do HTML encoding for all the encoders. There was a comment in the code that says we do HTML encoding all the time because people forget to HTML encode after.
So let me clarify that. All of the encoders will encode HTML sensitive characters such as angle brackets and ampersands, but they'll encode them in a manner appropriate for the representation that's being requested. For instance, the less than character, if it gets input to JavaScript encoder, won't actually be encoded as ampersand LT semicolon. It will actually be encoded as /U00 whatever. So that's what I meant by the comment is incorrect.
And it's always a cross-cutting thing where we don't want any HTML-ish things to get through,
Correct.
regardless of the destination.
Correct, and that was a holdover because this was originally intended for ASP.NET, and I have lost count of the number of application bugs I've seen that do encoding incorrectly. And this was a defense in depth mechanism in order to try to protect the application developer against misuse.
But I brought it up because I find it a bit. I understand why you did that, but it's kind of strange. You know, the URL encoder says I'm present encoding, yet it does more than just that.
Well, so it will always generate output that is legal for whatever encoding that is being requested. It's just it will potentially encode more characters than is strictly necessary, but again, the output is always legal.
But that seems like something that the fact that these are abstractions can nicely handle, because you can easily imagine the default being paranoid, and then having the option of to scale back the paranoia if you construct your own, right? Like to say, I really just want JavaScript safety. I don't care about angle brackets
just
or like
slash quotes and new lines. And
right. For example, but you could easily imagine with this design, the nice thing is we don't have static methods, so we could easily.
You would have to implement your own. So there are two ways to change.
It wouldn't have to be like that. No, we could offer you other instances on the default,
like a turn off the safety net switch.
Right. Like the Unicode encodings are like that, right?
I'm saying today, as it's implemented,
you would have to.
You would have to implement your own because there are two ways to control what characters these encoders encode. One is through the filters. There is going to be a code sample on filtering. Unfortunately, these HTML encoded, these additional safety net encodings are not part of the filtering mechanism. They're hard coded in the implementation.
Should we have some sort of pipelining mechanism, like if you wanted to combine JavaScript and HTML, you had to build in combine at some point?
And you have a pipeline chaining to multiple encoders.
You're not exactly what you want.
Yeah, it's not generally good.
It's like you want to get rid of the same characters that could impact HTML, but you have to get rid of them in a way that's legal for the destination that you're you're encoding to, right? So like that's semantically right. So like maybe and less than semicolon or whack you something, but no, you don't want. And if I understand correctly, correct me if I'm wrong. You don't want angle brackets to go through ever, but we make them not go through in the way that's specific to. So it's not like you can derive this from JavaScript plus HTML. Like there's no.
And also everything that you would hope to accomplish by chaining, you can accomplish by additional filtering. So like if you want to, there's a default encoder, and you want to actually ban more characters and encode more characters, you can use those filters.
Yeah, let's talk about the filters because I think there's already.
So filtering, I assume this is like a very advanced scenario.
Yeah, so this was actually based directly on the anti-XSS library. Basically, the original encoders in ASP.NET, I believe, encoded everything. They encoded everything like above the ASCII range, but below the below some other Unicode range. I forget the exact mechanism right now. But the anti-XSS libraries allow you to very specifically choose which ranges are allowed to go through and which aren't. One of the reasons that it does that is we received a lot of feedback, especially from a lot of East Asian websites, where the particular character sets that they use, it takes a lot of bytes to represent the HTML encoded form of some kanji character, for instance. So by allowing you to say, I want to poke a hole and allow, Japanese or Cyrillic or anything else to come through, then we can represent those in their native UTF-16 format, which makes the HTML a little bit prettier in the when it's going down to the client, lowers the web page response size, and so on. So it gives us a few nice benefits. Now, by default, none of these are enabled. By default, the only characters that can come through are US ASCII, basically. However, again, you can opt into individual subsets, or you can just opt into the entire world. Even if you say, I want to opt into the entire world, there are certain characters which are absolutely hard-coded, angle brackets, ampersands, plus, and so forth.
And those are hard-coded into the encoders themselves.
Correct.
All right. When you say that by default we let through basic ASCII, is that true for new code point filter, or is that true for like the code point filter that gets instantiated by those encoders?
I believe the code point filter constructor allows US ASCII, but let me check that.
You mean the default constructor?
Because I don't remember anymore.
Yeah, I don't remember. I am not 100% sure.
No, default constructor is empty, completely.
Oh,
empty.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
the sample is kind of.
Yeah, the sample actually that will encode absolutely every character.
Oh yeah. Well, except for the mathematical operators.
The supplemental mathematical. So for this particular input, it will encode everything though. Yeah,
Every single thing.
Yeah.
So.
And by the way, those ranges are defined in the Unicode 7 specification. So if you go to unicode.org, you can see exactly what characters those ranges correspond to.
Is that a new type that Unicode ranges?
Yes.
Does it belong here?
Well, so this is, there are lots of issues, and Matt has promised that he will do next week some work on this.
Okay, but we're not like, I mean, so everyone, I'm just late to the party, but everyone agrees that like things like Unicode characterizations, so forth, should not be like.
Yeah, it's more general purpose. We want to pull it out. It's just.
Okay.
Yeah. So the idea is that that's basically a glorified denum more than anything else. But it's a static factory pattern. So when you call Unicode ranges.supplemental mathematical operators, it's a property that returns an object of type Unicode range, and you can query it like what range of characters do you actually represent?
So I think my main thing is just like make sure that this note is already taken, but make sure that it's up one in the namespace, because like this is the kind of thing like as we get a new Unicode revisions and stuff, it has to be updated. It's not not just a web kind of a thing, right?
So it's already in a different namespace, but it's in the same DLL.
Okay.
And I think we should
probably get put somewhere else.
And possibly we should clean up the API even more, because I just cleaned up some like parameter names, like really trivial cleanup for those Unicode APIs, and potentially we may need to do more.
So before you go off filtering, I'm actually looking at the implementation for the code point filter right now, and to Wes's point about chaining these things together, I see that you have methods on code point filter to get the union of the instance as well as another instance of a code point filter, but you don't have something to get the intersection of. So all you can do when you have multiple code point filters you want to chain together is that you can add the allowed range rather than get the intersection of the allowed range.
Correct. So for symmetry, you're suggesting have an intersection operator?
Yeah, if someone wants to, for example, say I want something that's going to be displayed either URL encoded or something else encoded.
So the idea is that the individual encoders should still be responsible for denying certain characters, even if the code point filter allows those characters through. So, for instance, if you instantiate a code point filter that says allow absolutely everything, and then you query the code point filter object and say, do you allow ampersand? And the code point filter object says yes, the HTML encoder instance should still be responsible for saying no.
So what's the distinction between the replacement characters that are defined inside the encoders and the replacement characters that are defined inside the filters?
So the code point filters they don't actually tell you what the replacement characters are. They just say, is this character allowed to go through unescaped, yes or no? It's just a glorified bitmap.
Okay,
But if it says no, the encoder is responsible for doing whatever logic it needs to represent that character.
For the character,
yes. For some characters,
the encoder will override the filter and say, I'm going to go with no on this.
So that's what I'm wondering, is what distinguishes whether a character should be hard-coded into the encoder versus in the filter?
If it is absolutely always illegal for that character to be represented unescaped. So for HTML, ampersand, brackets, and so forth. For URLs, %. For JavaScript, / single and double quotes.
So the filter is like an application-specific supplemental character
Correct.
range that I want to
Correct.
it does feel though but so there's another one. That case seems obvious. Like it's illegal. The whole point is to make something
And
legal.
the output would be ambiguous.
Right.
Like if we let some of these characters, the output would be ambiguous.
Right. So those, but
Right.
then there's this extra one. That one was also hard coded. That feels like an outlier, which is like it might be fine as a default, but which is I don't have to. Like certain characters are only bad for HTML, but they're also hard coded into the other encoders for practical purposes. But that feels like from a design point, like that should at least be something that can be turned off. It felt like it wouldn't be incorrect.
It's not incorrect, but there have been. I'll say the number of patches we put out on Patch Tuesday would be less had we had this logic the whole time.
And if we think that the default is correct to do what it's doing here,
It's not incorrect.
then we can always add the option later, like if people say there's problems.
Yeah.
Right now, we have no data that says,
So
like,
my objection, so I think that's very pragmatic. It makes a lot of sense, especially if we have hard data that this is a problem and we're solving it.
We absolutely do have that.
I just my observation more just from the general purpose of like it's hard, makes it a little harder to describe the case where the filter says yes, but the encoder says no, because there are this case that's like, well, it's just trust me, like you don't want these HTML characters. Like yes, you could have them. It would not be ambiguous. It would be it'd be correct encoding to the destination, but these strings end up in places where is that basically am I understanding the logic here? Or
Yeah, so basically it's kind of funny because the question of intersection came up earlier. The way that the implementations for all of the encoders actually work is they all have their own internal code point filter that allows everything except for things like ampersands, brackets, and so forth. And then internally they do the intersection of their own internal code point filter and the one that's coming in. They take the intersection and they say, this is the one I'm actually applying. So there is actually an intersection operator, but it's internal. And it's specifically for the encoder's use.
Also, like the intersection, one comment I would add, I think the mental model of what happens when I intersect is kind of hard. The allow, deny is so simple. Like you have a set and you say allow, deny.
I was just
intersection is like, what did I end? Yeah, it's kind of.
I was just chaining back to Wes's question of how would we compose these if we wanted to.
The filters or the encoders?
Well,
it sounds like Wes was originally asking about the encoders, right?
Yeah, I was just repeating Steven's question.
Yeah, so it's pipelining the encoders is probably not something most people would ever want to do, and the reason for that is you're generally not going to take a string, encode it for one thing, and then immediately encode it for something else. Generally, what you're doing is you're take the example of of I'm creating HTML elements. A on-click equals hello username. Generally, what you would do is you have the on-click, the attribute whose contents are alert, hello, and then username, where username is input provided. Username you want to be JavaScript encoded because it's a JavaScript string, but you don't want that in and of itself to be HTML encoded. What you want to be HTML encoded is the whole string that contains it, alert, hello, username. So generally what you're doing is you do a first layer of encoding, you use that to build up another string, and then you encode that second string as a whole unit. So pipelining encoders directly isn't really a very big scenario.
So the last sample, if you could scroll, it's an implementation of a very useful encoder.
Ampersand encoder.
It's a problem that sometimes the sample is too fake to be useful. On the other hand, a real useful sample would be very long and it wouldn't fit on a page. But I think it gives you some idea what's happening when you implement the encoders. But as we mentioned before, that's gonna be very rare when people actually have to implement it. Not that nobody will ever do it, but it should be very, very rare.
So looking at this, though, I'm looking at this from one aspect of these all being public is that, and the other ones being extension methods is that I'm never gonna call find first character to encode.
Mm.
So this seems maybe and even
I think the strongest point, we are now back to should we add the extension methods to the abstraction? To me, you mentioned something very interesting. If helpers were on the abstraction, we could make these methods protected because they do show today IntelliSense. If you say, HTML encoder.default dot, you're gonna see these members that you should not be calling those.
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I guess not. I don't think you would ever call them.
No.
They're workers. They have pretty awkward signatures. The encodes one is not terrible. I don't know. Maybe you would just query, does the encoder encode this? But even that is weird. Most people are not even dealing with these hints or these char stars, right? Right. Fair. So that seems like a good reason to.
We could just make them. Could we make them protected internal?
Because then you
That's
can't.
the same as protected from. You can, but from the outside of the assembly, it doesn't make a difference.
No, but the helper methods are in the same assembly. They would be able to call them because they are internal.
You could do that, but you would end up with a very weird design where you have these two types
You can't write your own helper
that always have to go together. You might as well you're faking the fact.
So consider this: the helper methods right now, because these APIs are public, you could write a helper method that takes a car star instead of a car array, because I don't think such a helper method exists right now. You could write the implementation yourself. If these were protected internal, you could not do that.
Well, but it's the same if we just make them protected.
Correct.
And the helpers directly to the type.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that
Deriving from it. You can still derive from it and do it if you really want.
You can derive.
You cannot do a generic one.
So there are other ways than protected. You could also have some sort of indirection to this abstraction, so that this one is not hanging off the thing that everybody uses. Like you can have, the worker be like the algorithm can be a separate object from the, when you instantiate an HTML encoder, you can say this is the worker, and the worker could have public, you can imagine another abstraction with these four, and they're bridged together so that it's public, so that anyone could call it, but so that it doesn't show up in IntelliSense but these, by putting them public. Because right now, my only, and this isn't even a major concern, but it's just that when you mingle these together, it's going to be a little bit harder to know. I might be a bit intimidated by this. Even MSDN would show me all the things that are on the type at the top, and then all the things I want at the bottom.
One thing definitely I would like to do that I kind of forgot and didn't do, apply the editor browsable attributes to these methods. So that would help this a bit.
I
know. I'm not saying that that's the only solution.
So one of the things that the ASP.NET team has done in the past in order to work around this exact issue is they'll make all of these methods protected, and then they'll have an interface with explicit implementations that call the protected methods. That way it doesn't show up in IntelliSense, and you can call it if you cast first.
If we feel there's enough need to call it, I don't think there's enough need.
For this one, it wouldn't work. Like the performance, performance calling these through an interface would completely kill perf.
No, but you could still leave them
We're
protected.
already
internal.
calling them virtually though, but yes, interface would be worse. But
It would be worse, yes.
But I actually was going to ask about that was my next question actually. So I know this is super perfect tuned, but we call this once per code point.
Well, try
Call it once
encode
per
Unicode
character,
scalar once per code point.
Virtually.
Almost all of these, like I spend a day cleaning up the APIs and then a week optimizing
I
perf
believe you.
to get back to the
I
perf
believe
that
you.
they
So in the
You
ones
don't,
that
right?
we have
Because you do jump ahead
Find the
with
first
find
one.
first character, right? So you find the first character to encode, you encode it, and then I assume you find the next first character to encode it.
Oh, is that what you
do?
Is that not how it works?
It's not.
That's
I
not
was
how it
thinking about doing this. It doesn't do it today because there are so many trade-offs about like if let's say you every subsequent character is actually something that you need to encode.
Sure.
It would like also kill the perf in the mainline scenario, which is you don't have anything to encode, and suddenly you have like a small section to encode, and then
Is that known to be the main case? Is it like
the main case is that characters to encode are going to be probably few and far between.
what few and far between would suggest that what Matt said was what you want to do is basically repeat the algorithm. Now, like once you've found some, you encode them, then you go back and scan again.
The reason we didn't have to worry about this for the ASP.NET implementations is because when I did the original work for this, I guaranteed that there were no virtual calls. Everything was statically callable.
So, am I right that it seems that there's really nothing stopping us from switching to that with this, to what Matt said? To call to
the internal implementation. I agree that it's possible.
no, I mean,
It's not trivial. Like the code is.
but the API wouldn't have to change. So
Yeah,
they could
no.
decide, you know what, I'm going to do another find first
Correct.
instead of
It's just implement.
doing try. So, but today it does. Just so I understand, it does find first,
And then
try until the end.
correct.
But the performance characteristics that you measured, though, were still pretty good, weren't they?
Oh yeah. Yes.
This
I
is
think
not going to be the bottleneck in an application.
No. They were like, yeah, exactly. We are talking about like microseconds for like, yeah.
I guess the only reason that I'm even questioning it as a bottleneck is because we started to discuss that like the dispatch to these is so important that it's. I guess they're obviously they don't do a lot of work, right? So like.
The only thing I was saying is not that whether it's performant or not. It's just usage of these APIs is very performance sensitive. Like when I would make a small change in the extension method implementation, and the perf would switch not like by 10%, but would go down the drain. Depending how you call them, in what order, what you cache, whether you instantiate the buffer on the stack or on the heap, like very perf sensitive.
Makes sense.
What is I don't remember. What is like the additional cost of interface dispatch compared to virtual dispatch now? If you were to do this interface trick.
I think. But
Is it like
instead of just a
or is it like a
like on desktop, if I recall correctly, I don't remember how this works, but there's an optimization if the call site is monomorphic or not. But like if you have a call site that calls through all of these, then it starts to get hairy. But I mean, I don't know the exact details, but it's definitely still it's never going to be as good as the vtable.
Yeah.
At least that's my understanding. I know things may have changed, but
honestly, if we want to solve the problem of these members showing up as public, I would do either just collapse the extension methods in this one, or do the internal protected, basically change these to protected internal. I think those are the two relatively equivalent options.
I think we need to do both. One is make these protected, and the other is put the extension methods as instant methods on here. I think we need to do both of those.
As I said, I don't have a
why both?
I don't buy the extension methods being in the same library and actually adding value being separated from the
I agree with that.
And I don't want these to be showing up in everybody's.
Yeah, I get that.
Which is why
No. The moment we make them protected internal, they will stop showing up.
Agreed. So I'm just saying, I think we need to do both of those two options.
I agree with Wes, but I don't think protected internal with magic extension methods is a very coherent design. Like it's just like yes, it will work, but it's now these types are forever coupled to each other, and unless you either make them public, they're never going to be split apart.
But if the extension methods were hanging off of text encoder, and text encoder is the base class anyway, just make them instance methods.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're saying.
Yeah.
But so then they don't need to be protected internal. I mean, they could be, but that's not. No one would see that.
These would be protected, but
Yeah.
Right. My point is that if the design hinges on them being protected internal, if some implementation detail, protected internal doesn't exist from outside the assembly. From outside the assembly is protected. But if you want to make them protected internal because of some implementation detail, then be my guest. But if the design requires it, it's I would argue that's a design smell. Yeah.
I mean, the only real benefit by making them extension method is if we, for whatever reason later on, decide we want to type forward this guy out, right? But as soon as you want to type forward this guy out, as soon as you have internal, now you create a real nightmare, right? Because now it's super tightly coupled and no good luck reasoning about that part.
Right. But I think as long as the helpers are just helpers with no state that just call the other methods, it's not impure for them to be on the base.
My main, I don't think it's strong enough. My main benefit of them being, for making them extension methods, is that I feel like some of these overloads, some of these helpers, kind of should not be used, or may need to go away.
Well, that's interesting.
And how does that making them extension help with that?
It's easier to, I think, evolve APIs where the stable API is in the abstraction in one type and the other one is not.
But if you put them in the same assembly, they ship in the same vehicle, I would argue that you're not closer to that goal.
No, I'm not sure. In the past, we removed from I know we don't want to do it, but in the past it was easier for us to remove types from SKUs than carve members.
So my feedback would be if we want this purity, then they have to be public in some way. Let's design it right. If the idea is that there's these things that live on top that are implemented on top of this lower thing, and this lower thing has a design requirement to publicly make it so that this higher thing can be implemented. We can't cheat. We either say this is not a requirement, these are the more or less the helpers, we define them, and then these things are protected, or it's a requirement that these things can come and go and evolve on their own, that the lower thing needs to have public entry points. Now, if there's a problem with those public entry points being cluttered, then there are several ways we could design around it, or we could just leave them public. But I don't think we should internalize things, and then because we've done this in the past, and this is how we got into factoring problems, where we sort of had everything in one giant assembly, and then just we don't like this, and just internal, and then forever lost the sort of design goal when we actually go to factor.
Well, encoding has encoder and decoder. I think somebody proposed earlier using that same pattern for this.
Right. I said we could have a worker. The worker abstraction could be another public thing. So you have encoder dot. I don't know if worker is a good name, but character encoder, or scalar encoder, and that's the thing that does all the work. So that you have to at least dot off it to kind of find it. So the helpers end up getting better real estate. If that's the only worry, because these methods are not bad. My concern is that they're sort of like cluttery.
Yeah. Honestly, the interaction thing seems like twisting API too much for a purpose, that we can accomplish the same goal by just making this protected and adding the members to this type.
Right.
Honestly,
just fine.
Otherwise, we are just adding more and more types that people have to dot into, and I think it would complicate the design.
It's fine.
But you're worried that some of the encode methods may not be what we really want.
But it's not as strong. Honestly, I would, I don't know if you can represent I'm kind of trying.
Can I see them?
If I did not take the code from them, I would basically just add the helper methods to this type. I'm trying to be
realistic with the changes that you did.
Also,
not completely redesign, and not to I mean, they do have the objective. They wanted the abstract types to be pure. correct? Today they are pure.
Well, they
And they would not be. Correct. That one. So maybe we trade it off. I said, hey, I will make them abstract classes, but I will keep them pure. That was the deal that we had. Correct.
I think.
So I do this point. This does worry me though when someone says, well, these other things I put them over here because like they might not be the thing. Like, do we know? Like, they I thought I saw them. There weren't that many helpers, and they looked pretty darn simple and fine to me. I'm trying to understand why those would be in that.
I have the main problem
general.
I have with the one that actually takes a string and returns a string, because they are very convenient, but when you try to write performant code, you would want to encode directly to an output buffer.
I see, but we would never.
I agree with that, but I would argue that if you go down the span of T design, or whatever you want to call this, then I think that's probably not the only part of the framework we would have to be with this. So just having one area where we can be a bit cleaner. Also, like, you're not encoding things left and right usually. There's probably other APIs like substring, for example, or normal encoding with UTF-8 that is way more dominant.
That is, like, for me, okay. Like, it's like, oh, the new way will be more performant, but the old way is like perfectly well defined, just allocates more. It's not like a showstopper.
Fine, you convince me. I have no problem with helper APIs.
Right, so maybe we should walk the APIs then in the remaining hour to actually do an API review. Not just talk
Can I
about.
throw out another question? When you looked at the text encoder class, did you actually consider the system.text and that encoder class we have?
Yes.
What the drawbacks between merging two?
For example, they are stateful.
Okay.
And I think this is the major flaw of the existing encoder APIs. They are stateful. They have, and they cannot. I now don't remember. What is it?
Well, don't they?
A lot of the globalization stuff, yeah, when you're doing multiple
Complicated. It's much more complicated than.
Yeah, the APIs are more complicated. They are stateful, and I doubt.
So one of the things, this question came up earlier, like a few months back, and one of the concerns that I had was there are actually different layers in the OSI model. The existing encoder classes they work with characters and bytes because they're really working with things that you want to send over a network or persist to disk, whereas these are working at the application layer. They're changing the representation of the data, but it's still fully within the application. It's still part of the presentation layer, I should say.
This is always like, it's always text to text. It's not text to bytes or bytes to text. Like,
but I would say that, like, I looked into this. We talked about it, and I now forgot the details. If you open the encoder, the existing encoder abstractions, you can probably see it. It basically cannot be implemented not being stateful because it needs to remember the last things that it was encoding.
But it is fundamentally a different operation. Like, unless I'm misremembering which types we're talking about. They fundamentally saying take this and encode it as bytes is a different problem from, like, because it's a different problem from take this sequence of characters and give me another sequence of characters that has some characters represented as escaped characters within the like the input and the output isn't even the same.
There are some similarities, I would say. You can imagine that we would need HTML encoder to encode UTF-8 streams. Well, then it's going to be from bytes to bytes or from charts to bytes.
Feels like
it's changing representation. It's just changing representation in a different way.
I'm saying, to me, that seems like a pretty fundamental difference that explains why you would have different abstractions. Like, I don't even know how you would use the not how you would use them with the other encoders that are designed to make byte sequences from strings.
Do we ever think we'll actually send this string directly to byte array for sending over the wire network?
We talked about that before, actually.
So I mean, if we introduce that, then it starts to overlap even more.
Right, but then it can be. But then you could also.
Honestly, the statefulness is a ship stopper for this idea.
It's a question on the.
If somebody doesn't believe me, we can just open the.
I was saying that also it's a ship stopper that the input and outputs are not even defined to be the same thing. Like, I feel like this is a completely different API. But
so let's just agree that the existing API doesn't work on this.
Well, I'm not agreeing to that just yet. But I want to drill a little bit. Do we think that these encoders will all never need state? You can implement them all without having state.
I don't think that you would be able to do that in ASP.NET if you assume a DI container where these things are shared singletons. No, because then you lose concurrency immediately if you do that. Yeah. So I think that would be as Christoph said, that's a fundamental design assumption that you make that you can use these types concurrently.
The only other thing I'll add is the naming. Like you've got a general name called text encoder. Well, we have a text encoder. It's a system.text encoder, right? So
that part,
we have to figure out how we rationalize which one's which and what do people use which for.
One other thing with the naming is you have like an HTML encoder.default, which would be different than default HTML encoder past different code point filter in the constructor.
I don't remember, are the default static properties here settable or not?
No.
No, okay.
Well, you can't.
I feel like you almost need 2 words, but we called it URL encode already historically, but almost because like escaping and encode like
Oh, I see.
there are 2 different things like encoding coding for
It is
sequence,
escaping. Like,
right?
you're
It's
right,
escaping.
it's escaping.
Right?
Unfortunately, it's called encoding. Right.
I see, but it's an overloaded term, right?
I
Like
agree.
in the framework, most of the places where we say encoding, especially in the sister namespaces here, is to mean like make byte sequences so they can write them to disk or send them over the wire or whatever, right? Or vice versa, or deserialize. So here we need something else. I wonder, but I guess we could just add, instead of having text, we shouldn't have text encoder and system.text.encoder. We can't have both of those.
Yeah, that was.
But it could just be web encoder, no? Or if it's system. If we're using
So
web,
there is a web encoders class already. Just keep that in mind.
Escaping text encoder. I don't know.
But that also, like, does this have applications outside the web? All of the examples we've given so far are web specific, and that's kind of what this was
I think it
designed for.
would. That's why I kind of.
I think it's fine to have applications outside the web, and we'll get to that when we have the namespace too. Maybe that namespace is right or not, but it's just a matter of the confusion. How do I point people to use the existing system text encoder versus this?
So let's go to the email. Can we go to the actual API listing? And
Namespace is solid right now.
it's in system text encodings web. So what do you want
So
to?
web encoders could work.
What's in system text encodings?
What?
What's in one level up? System.text.
It's not a namespace
We just made 2 levels deeper.
because there's an encoding user type or whatever.
Yeah, I actually wanted.
I'm not crazy about that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, many of the names are taken. They are taken by types that already exist with the same name in a parent namespace, and
Well, could it
it's
be
not
like
like it's just stylistic. It just doesn't compile. And
system.text.web encoding? Like the dotting there is like, I guess we're gonna like. I don't like namespaces that don't have much in them. So encoding just has web in it after.
We could just remove encoding system text web potentially.
Encoding is a type.
Yeah, encoding is a type. Encoding encoder.
Of course it
decoding.
is. But system.text.web encoding, like or .web, like I just feel like we don't need 4 levels if there's nothing else in the 3rd level. That's a feedback. If you don't agree with me, it's fine. Just
yeah, I just wonder, like, system text web is such a broad, like, so many things can be there. That was the reason I added the
You can call it web encoding.
I mean, this is what we have currently. I mean, pretty much anything that starts with encoding or decoding is in system text. So it seems like it should really be parallel to text, or maybe sub to that. I mean, maybe even fine with sub to
I have
text.
no problem with adding another namespace here. I just didn't think we needed 2 levels.
Yeah, I
That's
agree
all,
with
that's
that.
all I was
Like
saying.
encoding seems weird because now the question is like, why are those going to be encoded in space?
Was different.
Well, then we should use a different term than encodings. I mean, maybe we
I
should
don't think
use.
3rd level should just be pure encoding by
Yeah,
itself.
I mean, you could call it web encodings that would,
Right.
that would work, for example, or I don't know, text encoding, whatever you want to call this, but it needs to be a different term than encoding, I believe, because that would be too much overlap.
Well, yeah, it can't be encoding anyway.
System text
So
web.
encodings, like even the
But
plural,
even
I don't-
encoding versus encodings is too subtle for my
Exactly.
for my taste. An S.
In
Like,
general,
but the S is a
aesthetics, I
namespace.
try to avoid
I don't like that.
compound words in namespace names, but I have no problem with it.
All right, so then that's actually.
Yeah, we had a side conversation. It's just aesthetics, but I don't like compound words or phrases in namespace nodes.
So
Do you consider
what's wrong
regular
with
expression as a
system.text.web?
namespace?
Web? I'd be okay with it.
System text web. Yeah. Do we think that it's only web?
Well, maybe web is up for debate, but if we were going to replace web, then maybe that other word would go just as well. Me, it's really the 4-level thing.
Escape, like escaping. I don't know.
I think that's more technically correct, but nobody's going to know that term.
Yeah.
Escape, they're trying to do text escape.
No,
Well,
probably
people
not.
get confused with URL encoding and URI at escaping all the time right now. We have URI.escape and unescape.
Interesting.
Actually, that's a good point. I mean, escaping may not be bad.
I feel like I would rather do system text web as much as it's not just for web, because escaping is not the term that people use to describe these
So,
algorithms.
I'm perfectly fine calling it web when some of the main things you're going to find is HTML and JavaScript. And these seem fine to be called. That's a purity.
But let me actually look up what the encoding the anti-XSS library has, because presumably Barry did all of that for a reason. It'll give us some idea too of how people might extend this.
Even if the only 15 minutes, that's not designed. Let's just take
Yeah.
and somebody proposes.
Mhm.
So I guess we should probably.
Yeah, the Unicode namespace I would almost propose. We can look at it, but it's super simple and we should probably wait for Matt.
So we start with the text encoder type, because that's the core type, right?
Yeah. Yes. But-
Starting from the inside out.
Well, I would start with the simple type and then add, because then conceptually it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because especially when people didn't like the naming text encoder, and many things will just fall through if we change the name, which I don't know what we'll change it to, but
Sure.
Escape.
Okay. We've already reviewed this one pretty close. I think we said protected and added instant method to it.
The name still is not good, but I would say now it's starting to leak into the problem with web not being a great name, but I would say web encoder would be consistent, at least if we're going with web as the only root thing.
except there's a type that is already
All
called
right.
that.
There's always a type.
And web won't make sense when we add other encoders for that.
So escaping text encoder or text escaping encoder or something. I don't know, some other qualifier. Because system.text.encoder and system.text.web.text encoder. It's like text.encoder and text encoder is like.
Is it really do people really think of it as text.encoder? Like,
Maybe that's just me.
Well, if you're coming new to .NET, for example, you see something that's in system.text and then called encoder, and you see something called text encoder, I'm going to lean towards text encoding, and it's probably.
but it's going to be in system.text.web, right? Like if they were in the same namespace, I would agree with you. But if they're not in the same namespace, and one's in a sub namespace of the other, and it's like web-based.
I don't necessarily buy that still. I think text encoder. I'm going to gravitate towards that guy when I actually really want the other one.
You probably won't though, because the other one's in the better namespace, right?
But if you go towards encoder, let's say that you came here instead of going to encoder, which I don't even think you want to go to anyway, because you want to go to something off of the encoding class, right? Like you want a concrete encoder if you're on the let me put this thing in a UTF or something form. This isn't going to do what you want. It's not like you're going to write a bunch of code against these things and then be like, oh, I adopted the thing that's dead or whatever. You just be like, well, that can't be where I need to go. Let me look.
What I worry about is people going and finding this and trying to figure out how to use it in this.
But you actually have this problem inherent.
If they find encoder, they're kind of in a bad state too, because it's abstract, right? You can't do anything with it.
Right. It's similarly not what you want. You need to find encoding.
Yeah, encoding.
I'm still confused about the fact that all the encoders in system.text are about code points and these are about escaping. I don't think escaping is too weird, but I don't know. I'm not a minority in that.
But it's called URL encoding, right?
Is it called
Who calls it
JavaScript?
that? Because we called it that? Because everyone calls it that?
No, I think everyone calls
When you
it.
go to Wikipedia article, it's called % encoding.
I see, but in the JavaScript case,
I mean, let's just take the note and then maybe we can do something with it or not, because clearly we can't get a consensus.
I'm fine with it.
But I would still agree that it is an issue. The name seems, Because also, like, if you look at code, you use somebody just text.encoder, you just briefly scan over it. Like, it's not awesome with the name. So if we can find a better one, can we convince otherwise?
Kind of convinced me that.
But I still think it's bad enough to actually think about it.
So what are we doing with? So are we changing it to have the extension method be part of the text encoder?
Yes.
That's the feedback
I would.
You fine with it?
Yeah.
Right.
So while we're looking at while we're looking at those,
I don't speak for the ASP.NET team. I don't speak for them.
You speak for this library,
Sure.
All right. So.
while we're here looking at the encode methods, I want to inject the comments from the Google Hangout from Ben Adams, who asks, encode to ref byte array for network streams.
This is like
Encode.
this is like
Straight to refs. Oh, yeah.
I think this is like there's like this larger scale issue here, which is like this stuff is all about escaping UTF-16 to UTF-16, right? And like if you think it's like this web focused scenario, like I know we've been trying to think like what does some like pure UTF-8 pipeline look like, and if we had that, like,
Correct.
do we have to design analogs of these that operate on byte streams or byte buffers or whatever
No,
that do this?
something
like,
interesting is that I know this is a conversation that you and I have had a while back, but you don't have to change the text encoder class to enable that. The text encoder class is still just fine as is.
Well, you kind of
You
want
have
to
to
change
change
stars
the
to bytes.
Not necessarily,
But you
because
don't
you can have
I
a separate
agree.
component that does that, and it doesn't do any additional allocations. Performance should still be
Yeah.
good.
Oh, meaning that you just sort of you have some temper, but you still have to go.
You
Just
pipeline yourself, but you don't pipeline through like HTML URL encoder stuff like that. You pipeline directly to the base class.
You don't need to like allocate a bunch, but you do need to.
Correct.
You do need to create sequences of UTF-16 encoded data to
Yes.
pass down,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
But so this is when we talked about this. I was hoping that we can evolve the API
Okay.
to not do any copies, not do anything. Just basically, I pass a byte array
Right.
of UTF-8 characters, and I encode them to
Straight
HTML
away.
encoded UTF-8 characters.
Byte stuff.
For this abstraction to be completely general purpose, it would have the char stars would have to be changed to byte stars.
and
then
you would have to pass some
You'd have to
encoding
pass
around.
encoding.
Yes. Or just
You mean
simply-
the encoding?
You have to say
No,
something
byte
about what that byte star
No,
points to, right?
that could be done by basically there could be HTML UTF-16 encoder and HTML UTF-8.
Yeah, sure.
Not a configuration, but it would be a different types. And I actually think it would be more performant if they were actually different types and not like single implementation switching.
So,
Whether it's UTF-16 or UTF-8.
I mean, you could make it byte star today and have a property that says, dot encoding or something, and today they're all return UTF-16. There's no way to get a non-UTF-16 one, and then these byte stars, you could cast them to char stars if you wanted. Right? I mean, like we could say that the only encodings that we use today, but this is like starting to get hacky.
Yeah.
But you could, if you feel like that's the right design, you could actually do that now.
I think the design should look like it composes, but I think it's fine to say if I know it's UTF-8, I call the different implementation, just bypass the encoder that you have given to me. If I know that encoder is UTF-8 encoder, for example, right? And then you could make some assumptions in the implementation in order
You
to.
can't do that.
The thing you have to be careful of if you go down that path is like if I take an abstract encoder and like previously everyone always thought it was UTF-16, then we put these UTF-8 ones on the scene, like, and then you just have this generic thing, like, is it?
Well, I
do we-
personally would rather the encoding be passed with the bytes than
Yeah, I prefer
abstraction
that.
just taking bytes. But
So I think I'm now kind of trying to recall when we had the discussion, a couple of months ago, how I hope to evolve it to enable this scenario. I was hoping that we can just add overloads to those two methods that take byte stars. The default implementation.
Like the default, if you took the encoding, right, you could like, yeah, you could.
certain amount in
They do.
That's
but-
what they would have to do.
So the bit of the bit.
Because they have to call to be,
Actually,
either they throw or they have to call through these ones if they're new. So to call through these ones, they would have to copy somewhere because they would have data in the wrong the wrong,
but
the
a
wrong
small
byte.
stack outlet buffer.
They could, yeah, exactly. You could.
So let me do this. Let's not design it here
Yeah.
because we don't have time. But let me do this. Let's add an additional issue. I will actually do an experiment. What it would mean to support UTF-8. Let's treat it as a kind of separate. Because I think there was like
right now. So I mean, you can do it right now with composing and
it's almost like a separate feature request on this API. This was mainly kind of let's BCLize existing APIs and the scenarios that they implement. But I will dig into this a bit more.
I think this answers the second question from Ben. We don't know.
Yep.
But we're gonna find out.
We'll find out. And by we, I mean somebody else. All right, so then that's that. I think so. We are agreeing that these guys should be protected, I guess, right? Because they're the worker ones, and this is the one that probably should also be protected, I guess, because it's considerably public implementation. But it seems like a nice thing that you may want to call publicly. But I don't know.
Code's like the right
I don't know.
in there, like
Yeah, I was trying to
it's
come-
like does encode or I don't know, like it.
So first, let me answer your question. I believe they should all be protected. I mean, honestly, not like some of them you could kind of say like
I could maybe see encodes, right? Like,
but
Take
I-
a hint. This is an int.
yeah.
Do I want
Um,
to do so for the other for encoding? I
but-
sometimes use that max character thing to just. Sometimes you want to allocate it.
It's just it's for optimization of the performance. So like we know how large a buffer on the stack to instantiate. Basically, the stack alloc, the helper
But
method.
do I ever want to do that? Like, because if I want to pass in my own array or something and say like, okay, well, let me decide how big I want to make my arrays.
But we don't have public API. Yeah.
None. I thought we had one that takes.
It takes a char array, but it's an input array, not output.
outputs all text.
Oh, I see. Then fine. Yes.
But maybe at some point, maybe, but changing from protected to public is fine, correct?
Not on the virtual.
No, that breaks.
because then the overrider would have to say.
So maybe this one. What about this? Like this one, I can kind of see how in the future, let's say we had helper methods,
So
where
you
they
could give
encode
you
into
give
a
the
byte
protected
array.
ones less good names, so
Yeah.
that you have the option of adding the public one to call through the less good name.
This is the one that is most likely to get duplicated or changed or something if we start doing bytes though, right? Because this is talking about sizes of output buffers in terms of input buffers. And so then when you start having arbitrary encodings, like this thing gets worse. So
Well, except that this one says for every char, how many chars?
So
If
is
we
that-
have bytes,
so this
it
means
would be for every char, how many bytes?
we say character, we have different.
by character, you mean code point, right?
Yeah.
Code point, scalar specifically,
Well-
not char.
We should use the terms consistently here. So we say characters and
That's why the API explicitly uses the term scalar in all of the parameters.
so
because
max
it is a
output
scalar.
characters per input character means character here means char.
Does it means char or
It means-
it
It means char. It literally means char.
I see, because of how you do one at a, you call one at a time.
So okay. So,
So-
we say Unicode scalar when we say for code point or
Yeah. And
And
char means UTF-16 code.
character means char and char is UTF-16.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but I think the name of the encodes, I have to say I don't like it. Matt brought up the issue. I don't know what's a better name. I couldn't come up with anything. If you will have
What does it
suggestions.
return? Like,
It basically says, do you encode this one?
I get that, but does that already do the intersection between the filter that's positive?
Yes.
Yes, that one is actually
Yeah.
what it really encodes.
Okay.
Basically, if encodes returns false, then that just means return that character right away. Or scalar.
So yeah, encodes kind of like is a weird
When do you call? when
name
do we
because it would be nice if it was
why do we
a
need this
question.
from the base though? If it's protected, why do we call that? Because we don't we just say
Try
say
encode.
find and then encode?
No, because after you find the first one, then it calls this one for subsequent characters.
But how is encodes different than try encode?
Yeah. Does the base
Um,
if it's protected only the base will be able to use it? Why does the base need it?
Sorry, I'm missing what?
So can you just call try encode, and if it returns false, then it doesn't encode the character or the scalar?
I assume that also would.
Of course, it does require you to pass in all of those other parameters.
I think that's in, what is the, so the return value of try encode Unicode scalar, what is that? Is that if it encoded or not, or if there was not enough space to do the encoding, right? Like.
It was if it was not enough space.
Yeah. Like I assume even if it's a no-op, it just copies the thing to the output buffer, right? So like,
It's not enough space, and now I remember why
Now
the
I see why
encodement.
these names are confusing because I didn't get that.
Yeah. So now I remember why encode method needs to be encodes. We need to have a separate encodes from try encode Unicode scalar because computing the scalar is expensive. I think I didn't have this method, and it was like
Hitting the skill.
You have to pass it to both of them.
it's cheap in in absolute terms.
You
pass it
take
to
two
both of them.
characters and then just fiddle them.
Yeah.
I don't see
well, there's the if check, right? We have to see if it's a surrogate.
Oh no, both take.
No.
No, maybe that's not what it is.
I mean, you do, but that's
I think it's probably
so cheap.
Sure,
It's
I'm
like a
just saying.
nanosecond. It's
Saying.
one
It's not
nanosecond.
just.
Sorry, I forgot. But I know that I.
Figure out what
Yeah.
a better name for it.
Okay, but I think there is a general question, like, just a general point is to take a look at the sort of try versus the one that also returns a bool. There's some confusion about what the distinction is.
What do you mean? I don't. Why do we need encodes in addition to try encode scalars? It is perf. I didn't have encodes, and it was not as performant as their implementation in the past. I had to add it back because they had something like this. I can, if people feel strongly about this, I can dig out and try to figure out why.
Strongly, it's just how
I'd like to understand, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one is, I don't know. Maybe I'm just too specific, but that seems like that should be differentiated with the name somehow. And then this one, we said we need it for perf.
I think it's both perf and the issue that you guys observed that the Boolean means different thing. But what I was saying is like I don't like the name encodes. I would like it to be a question.
Will be
It is a
encoded,
question.
or is subject to encoding.
Will
Is
encode.
subject to be encoded?
I don't know.
Requires escape. Requires
Should encode. It could be should encode because after you call encode, if that's what it is, you always call encodes and then
Maybe.
I don't know. I'd have to see the actual caller.
Well, it's not should, it's must, really.
I mean, needs encoding? I don't know.
I still feel like you
Required that you encode.
I feel like
Basically.
I
As in,
feel
it
like
is a
if perf
violation
is the issue
to
though,
not encode it.
then collapsing the calls would be better. But I still don't understand. But yeah, like if you
Where does one get the Unicode scale that they're passing to this guy? Is it
make it right,
is it part of
So when you're going over the string, you're building up the scalars from the characters that you read in. That's what the encode implementations do.
But it's. I think it's. Wes has an interesting point. To implement a custom encoder, you need a routine to compute a scalar from a char. We don't expose it publicly.
no, we have a way to do that. There's something
Yeah.
on char info or
Oh,
something.
really?
Yeah,
Char
there's
has
like
the
it's UTF. You give it a high surrogate and a low surrogate, and it gives you back a thing. You have to. It's not completely straightforward because you have to. I think you have to do the surrogate test yourself. Be like, is the thing a leading surrogate? And then if so, here's the method that combines them. But you don't have to look up with a bit twiddling.
There's also an internal API in here that you can make public if you want to that basically says given a string, return an IEnumerable of surrogates or an IEnumerable of scalars.
which we have, but is in a very awkward place.
It is, but it's
And it's not quite an
internal.
IEnumerable too. It's
Yeah,
really weird,
it's-
really bad API, but
Well, because it's allocation free, that's why it's not IEnumerable.
All right. So we agree that we don't have it with the name, but nobody can know something
Well,
about
I think we need to understand why it has to be there too, because like
you can't come up with a good name if you don't understand.
It's not clear to me at all why it needs to be there.
I know. So Matt, like just this thing, like it's called on each scalar,
Yes.
and then if it returns true, it's encoded. Otherwise, it's not.
Okay.
And the boolean on the try encode means I couldn't fit in the buffer.
So you could have,
Wait,
you could have an
wait,
When
enum.
would that ever happen though? Because you call max output characters per input character.
Let's speculate any further.
let's
This
talk
actually
about-
makes
We'll
some-
talk offline, because we don't.
But try and code doesn't even does try encode even check to see whether it needs to encode?
No.
Okay, it just trusts you already called. Do
yeah.
I need to
So
encode
we
it?
should talk offline.
All right, so that basically covers text encoder and text encoder extensions. Then I guess what would the next thing to look at?
Well, then the three encoders.
So let's
JavaScript encoder.
send the URL because it's conveniently already here.
Note that they are again abstract.
So one thing I know, and it kind of related to this, is so we have this default method, and then we have these public default, default URL encoder types. And why are they public? Like, I would understand perhaps if the return value of the default was a default thing, so you could do the devirtualization, but it doesn't appear.
Do you remember we had this discussion because initially I made them the default implementations were internal. I now forgot why.
Maybe if
you guys.
maybe if you wanted to make your own encoder, but you wanted to be able to call base. They're sealed. Oh, good point. Okay, then
The reason they were sealed originally in ASP.NET was because we didn't want people changing one overload, not changing the others. That's why we did it originally in ASP.NET.
I see. I think the reason was something with instantiation and the ranges and filters.
But you have the
factory methods.
You have the factory methods. They can construct the defaults.
I would try to make the concrete ones.
Okay. Add an issue. I will dig out email threads. I mean, we had email threads about this because I know.
Yeah.
And
I don't like them public as well because of the naming confusion, right? Where the default URL encoder is going to be different than URL encoder.default.
If you do new
shit
code
with
point
new-
filter,
yeah.
it encodes everything
I mean,
because the default code point filter allows nothing through.
Build
Which
it
is
in.
like also kind of.
I see that as weird.
I mean, I kind of buy the argument that you don't want to override part of it, but if I want to mess with the URL encoder, probably I want to override only part of it. I don't want to necessarily implement the whole thing from scratch.
The problem I think is like, what are the sorts of like it's not like we're still kind of in the world where there are these like four methods that you kind of need, they kind of tie together, right? Is like if you change one, you're probably going to need to change others of them.
Yes.
So,
But it depends on the chain, right? It's probably fine to just overriding codes, right?
I think this may have been a holdover from the original ASP.NET APIs.
Yeah.
Where they were sealed because the classes themselves contained the instance methods
Yes.
that were all virtual that did the implementation.
That makes sense.
my preference would be a design where we don't expose the concrete types. And
We unseal these and then.
no, I would keep them sealed, and I would also make them internal or private or.
Yeah,
I like that.
I agree with that.
Is there no
Okay, the
need
default one.
for filtering of
Because
those?
you have factories to create these anyway.
And you have factories.
Yeah.
So they have no.
They have no purpose.
Except that they can
They show up in places, but you
Like,
can already get them.
well, if they're a seal, then I can literally not derive from them. But
The
then
only reason I could see you doing it is if you had the return type of default be default URL encoder or default HTML encoder on some
Oh, I
like play
see,
to
yeah.
get devirtualization, but like
Yeah,
we're not doing that. So
Just-
like
yeah, internalize all of them.
So, but
could
why
always-
are they even separate classes?
Well, that's an implementation detail.
Because you have an abstract base class instead of interfaces.
that doesn't.
There's
matter.
only one encode method for the entire class.
Like JavaScript encoder is still an abstraction, right? It's not. It's by design. The only thing that it tells you is that it's a JavaScript.
And I'm just wondering what's in like the default versions versus what's in JavaScript encoder, besides helper methods to create the concrete thing.
Guessing JavaScript encoder is.
I think there's nothing in it.
No, I think the default implementations have the deny list logic, where they say like ampersand is always encoded.
That makes sense.
And so forth.
You're saying that's in, well, that's in default JavaScript encoder.
Yes, but I don't think it's in the JavaScript encoder base class.
Maybe it should be.
No, yeah, well, I mean, so to answer your question, nothing is in JavaScript encoder, nothing is in the abstract base classes, they're just factories.
Great.
But the types were added because so initially I had the following design. There was text encoder, and then 3 concrete implementations. That's it. but that kind of, they gave me feedback that you kind of often want to say, I want HTML encoder. Yeah. I'm not fine with any text encoders. I want specifically HTML encoder. And that's why the intermediary abstract classes were added.
Oh, right, because for DI, right? For DI, you have to take a JavaScript encoder and an HTML encoder and so on and so on. You can't just have 3 parameters all called text encoder.
Because then it'll just pass them.
Yeah, it'll just pass in the same thing.
But
so the main
different implementations of those because you want to mock them, or
no, because one does HTML, one does JavaScript, one does URL. They all have different.
Yeah, exactly. So we have that. But then why do we have the default? Why do we have this?
The base and then the
default derived from the.
Oh, I think we were saying just internalize them because you have static factors to create them.
No, I think the question is, why would we not just take all the overrides that are in the default, move them literally onto the JavaScript encoder, and make the type
because we want to keep it pure.
Yeah.
Put all the implementation and make the abstract become virtual.
Unicode
and now a JavaScript encoder always carries our implementation, every single one, whether it's ours or not.
Yeah. Whereas we want to seal the default JavaScript encoder so that someone can't, take it and mess with it.
Yeah. So every JavaScript encoder would have to know about code point filter and Unicode range, which is an implementation detail.
All right, let me just take out the email thread that we had about the default one.
That makes sense.
That's why we made it public. This type that I'm not thrilled about. iCode point filter. Imo?
This one here?
At the very top of your screen now.
Whoa.
Code point filter first?
Sure.
Before we get, I want to understand that.
Yeah, so the idea behind code point filter is it's a glorified bitmap that tells you these characters can go through unescaped, these characters have to be escaped.
My first question is, in the sample that I saw dot allow, and the return value was on the floor, so I assumed that it would be void and mutable. But now I look at this and I assume that
code point filter is mutable.
I don't like
it's mutable.
So I know String Builder does this,
yeah.
But I personally, especially with the ever increasing amount of immutability in .NET API, I find that losing the opportunity to communicate with the return value is I know there is precedent. I'm not a fan of you can chain it or you can not chain it because it actually mutated and returns this, but this is already
you prefer for these all to return void to make clear that it mutates?
Yes, if you want them to, yes. Make a decision. Basically, don't say, "Oh yeah, you can get to this pointer that we also mutated."
I agree completely.
Yeah, I would actually prefer they're not mutable because, as you said, you pass them in as arguments into something that you consider a signal and then be used concurrently.
So the APIs that take these as parameters always clone them so that they can no longer be mutated after the fact.
That seems like a better design would be to make it so they didn't have to do that.
There's a copy constructor.
There's a copy constructor, yeah.
It's the second constructor. It takes that code point.
If you implement and then call it constructors.
It's still a clone operation because you see that code points and literally enumerates through everything and copies it.
So how many of these do you typically do?
It is literally foolproof.
So I don't know. I mean, it could be immutable easily, right? And then you wouldn't have to worry about copying and never make a mistake. I guess the mistake you could make is you think you allowed characters and you just drop it on the floor.
So if it's immutable, keep in mind these things might be somewhat expensive to construct.
How often do you construct these? You create your filter
for every character you
once, right?
Once per encoder.
Yeah. So the pattern that I've seen people do and the pattern that we've been encouraging is you create a code point filter and then you call allow character a few times in a row. Imagine that every single one of those is an 8K copy.
Hang on, now all the API that take one of these have to copy it defensively versus if you only made a few copies as you were building them up and then you could pass it around forever. Wouldn't that be safer?
You pass it once. So this is a builder. Think about this as a builder. You basically create it and then you mutate, build. At the end you say, now give me all the characters that you allow or don't, and that's what encoder uses.
This is an encoder builder.
That's a fine pattern too, but then the naming should, I think the copy constructor is a bit subtle for that. Because I mean, you basically have to know that you as an implementer are supposed to do that. That's not necessarily obvious, right? If you call this builder, and then you just change the APIs to take the non-builder, the call side has to call freeze or whatever
No, no, no.
to
This
get
API, you cannot use this API without doing what you need to do. Look, there's no usage. You cannot get characters that are banned, except for calling the method get allowed code points.
Yeah, but you don't have to copy it.
Yes. Yeah, you don't have to copy. This method
But
copies.
you could easily make the mistake of just keeping the filter and calling his character.
My point is, if you implement a text,
Describe what the mistake is. What mistake can you make?
so if you implement a text encoder, I have to know that as an implementer, when I accept this guy, I should call the copy constructor.
No, you don't have to. I think I disagree with you that you have to copy the call the copy constructor.
The only reason we did it in ASP.NET was because we wanted the APIs to be absolutely foolproof. That's also why everything's sealed.
But I actually no. What I'm saying is we may check, but I suspect that you don't call the copy constructor. You just call get allowed code points.
Well,
But how
internally you
would that
call
be safe concurrently?
So
The reason we have to call the copy constructor anyway is because the implementation actually does really weird stuff with bit mapping behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean this type is not used past the constructor call.
I think my argument is that like if you design a system with text encoders where these things are used concurrently, you cannot have a reference to a reference type that is potentially being mutated as you read from it. I think that's a fundamentally messed up design. Like either we are saying this is fundamentally something that we believe is concurrently
only used in the construction.
No, during construction.
Well, then you could stash it away, but.
So the thing is,
weird thing is, it's weird that the filter is only associated with the
Oh, I see what you're saying.
creation of the defaults. Basically, there's no wiring of filtering down to the abstraction. Am I missing something, or
Because it's an implementation detail.
it's an implementation detail? Only the default.
the thing is though that so I understand how the implementation today essentially freezes at construction time by calling the filter get allowed characters, which returns the bitmap.
Yes.
But that's an internal member, right?
Yeah, correct. It's
So
not a-
imagine that I'm implementing my own encoder that encodes to like LDAP or whatever.
Yep.
I can't use that method. So I have to go through this get allowed code points thing. That's not going to do a freeze, is it?
Well, I mean, the enumerable that you get back, you could always just create your own bitmap based on that. The idea is hopefully code point filter is not being mutated while you're enumerating over get allowed code points.
All right.
I feel similar to Emo, like
you could capture that in the API if you wanted to.
I honestly think if you have a design where you basically allow things to compose and you say, well, at the end, I want to have an effective bitmap that represents what I did. I think that's a sound design. And you can just say bitmap is immutable, and the thing that yields to that bitmap is mutable, but you never pass this guy around, so it doesn't really matter. Because in the end, you just say, the bitmap is my exchange type that I accept in my actual encoders, and they take those as an argument, not the actual thing that you use to actually construct it in the first place.
But the bitmap is so
The bitmap is
implementation
literally a
specific,
bit array.
and it's enormous.
I mean, whatever representation you choose. I mean, obviously I wouldn't take an int array, but I mean, you could come up with some type.
Have another type.
Yeah, just have the structure, whatever that
Well,
represents.
no. Why don't you just make the constructors take IEnumerable int then? If that's all.
Constructor of what?
A code point filter constructor. I mean, it does basically. That's what code point filter is.
Of the why does default HTML? So if it's true that the thing is this is the builder, when you're done you get the code points, then why don't the things that are asking for code point filters just ask for the I code? Why is it in an I then? Why is there a
Oh yeah, why doesn't it take the I?
Well, I guess in that case you have the same problem, right?
either it's because it needs
it's immutable, so you kind of want to do that same thing.
Well, why the constructors of the encoders don't take I?
Yeah, because in the ASP.NET code they do take the I code point filter, not the concrete.
Yeah, so I actually don't understand why we have the interface.
So hold on. Are you asking?
The I code point filter. That's what I started this discussion.
The reason that the interface is there is to allow future expandability for actual characters.
Following your train of thought, would it make sense for the HTML encoder not to take the code point filter or the I code point filter, but to take allowed characters bitmap?
No. Allow character bitmap.
You're making that a public type.
I don't think you want to communicate that. I mean that is all about being able to do these queries quickly, right?
Yeah.
Like that's about the implementation details. Like
What other
No,
other coders want to use it though?
The additional. The main reason for not taking character bitmap is that you want to sometimes like compose like the Unicode ranges. You can pass parameter of those, and then you actually put them all into one bitmap.
Yeah.
If we expose the bitmap itself publicly, we need to now have APIs to compose bitmaps, and also bitmap is optimization. It's just an optimization implementation of.
it doesn't look
We don't have to expose the little bit. All I'm saying is that if you have a type that is fairly constructed, it makes sense to have a flattened operation that gives you something that is more efficient. Whether
Yeah. I mean, all of those types exist. They're just all internal.
Yeah.
You can imagine an encoder that encodes all characters.
Yeah.
Well, it would not need a bitmap.
You pass in Unicode range.none basically.
Wow, but this is special case.
Right.
too.
So then why would you call? Yeah, you. There's been some. I'm sorry.
like imagine. I guess the thing that so Levi, you had the point of like one of the reasons these things aren't immutable is because it could be expensive to copy them. Like you could redesign this such that the freeze happens when you call either get allowed code points or get bitmap, right? And then these adders could be very cheap. You're just stashing pointers, right? And then when someone wants to get the bitmap, you actually do the construction of the thing.
Well, at that point, you may as well just have a separate bitmap class.
You could have filter builder,
like string builder,
filter builder, and code point filter. Have the builder have all these functions, and then just have that's the concern. Returns. I think right now this type is quite busy. It's like it's returning instances. The operations can be changed. It can be copied.
So I agree with this one. I completely agree that I would like to change the return types to void. I have to say I don't agree about making it immutable because I think it would. If
you have is character allowed method there, then my fear is that people are going to take a code point filter, which is mutable. They're not going to call get allowed code points because they have this is character allowed thing, right? They're just going to hold on to it, and periodically they're just going to call is character allowed, and now the thing is mutating. Like if there was if is character allowed wasn't there, and you had to go through this like get allowed code points thing, where it was clear like you were doing a handoff and you could freeze, then it kind of makes more sense.
You could remove this character allowed. No one uses it.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Now the downside of
like first there.
The downside of
that's always sparse.
It's there just when you're building it in case you want to query it, but none of the encoders.
But if you had a dense thing, wouldn't that so how do you?
So the one downside of
what do? You take the enumerable and then you.
There's
the
thing is that
I see.
This is a builder. Its implementation is so inefficient in comparison to what actual encoder needs to do.
Yeah.
Every single encoder would just use it as a builder, then call get allowed code points, and then build the fastest representation in memory representation for its usage.
So this is actually the implementation of code point filter is backed. There's a backing field which is an interarray. All of the encoders basically clone that interarray and use it directly. That's how they are able to get the efficiency, even though code point filter
feels like another case of like there's some secret sauce that's hidden.
Oh, of course there's secret sauce.
But it could be made public if with a bit of.
With design, it could be made public.
With design, yeah, because of the secret sauce intentionally is hidden because we're not done designing it yet.
That's fine.
But I would say there's more to it than just not designing. I think depending on what encoding you're doing, you would want a different representation of the fast database. It's basically a database, correct?
It will,
and depending on what you're encoding, what you're doing, you probably would want to slightly different.
The thing about the database is you don't want to be calling virtually through it, I guess, because it seems like a pretty easy thing to define an interface.
Well, the other thing too
is this allowed? It seems like
that you were working on support for actual characters, correct?
I was thinking about it, yeah.
Because so you want to devirtualize it, but
you do that,
that's the thing.
It's
not that the interface is fine.
Yeah, I understand.
It needs to change radically.
I mean, the implementations have an array.
Can we just have one conversation? Otherwise, it's hard. Like two people are talking.
So I guess like
it's not future proof.
So if we did something like we removed the is character allowed method,
Okay.
and then we would realize at some point we may need to expose some way to like freeze, like some better way to go from enumeral of int to like a quick database check, and maybe we can design something there. But we could ship v1 of this type with just get allowed code points kind of being the freezer, and then make the rest of the methods void returning.
We call get allowed. So we assume that the allowed code point is always sparse, like to build a database. Like if you ever have like,
Yeah, but
that's the only entry point. Like
That's the only entry point. That's basically the freeze method.
But so
Code points.
so presumably we assume that constructing this bitmap is going to be relatively quick. So we assume that like we don't have like a filter that's like I allow like the allowed ranges are all like, because isn't this going to feel like
I don't.
you're going to iterate through all of them, right?
Sure, but you do that once.
But I mean, it could be there's a lot of code points like I don't understand, like if they're all allowed,
Well,
so slow.
I mean, it's get allowed code points in the worst case will give you back like 1 million some odd entries.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to use that in default URL encoder.
Well, during construction, it would be acceptable. During the actual lookup,
It's more than, isn't it like? Yeah.
I think it's 1 million code points, which is defined. Maybe like 1.2 million.
Is allowed. Oh, it's characters.
There's
Oh, no.
It's like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the side of the
Yeah,
range,
yeah.
right? Like
Okay, no,
there are
really.
giant gaps.
These are code point filters, but it's ints.
Yeah.
There are gaps, sure, but it's still a big number. Anyways, okay.
Yeah, but again, you're only ever
And
looking
that's
at it during construction of the encoding classes. The encoding classes, the constructors are actually documented as being expensive to call. Construct it once and then scroll it away and keep reusing the instance over and over and over again.
And the alternative is we return an array, and
But that's
there's
an
no other
implementation.
alternatives, right?
No, I guess not.
Well, I mean, you use an interface and then you trade off the startup.
The
or-
alternative is
The
the alternative is you return an object. You have the freeze return a database which has no virtual methods on it, which is usable and fast and then it's like you can call this thing. You can call it. It's mutable and then it's useful. But so the representation, like I'm not understanding why. Like there's an internal representation of this database,
Yes.
which is good. It's the same one used for everybody,
Yes.
But
But why can't that
it's not the same. That's what I'm getting at. Let's say you have an encoder that encodes everything except 5 characters. You would not want the int array that is enormous to be a representation of it. You would want to have a type that has 5 fields. Correct? Like the representation of the database is very, very different depending on what encoding you do. I mean, we may say, well, those are the most common encoders. Somebody has an exotic encoder that encodes 5 characters of your choice and not anything else. We don't care about perf. That's a fine statement,
No,
but
I mean, it's possible to even have an. You don't want any. Okay.
I mean, it makes sense to have it as a generic representation.
what if there's, what if there's no database? On Tuesdays you encode this, and on Wednesdays you encode something else. You don't have a database. You query the current daytime, or
presumably whatever you. No, but it sounds like the answer to like this is contractual, right? The sequence of allows and forbids give a correct answer from the last 2 methods, right? Like there's no Tuesday. Like I assume that's not part of this contract of code point.
Not this contract, correct?
Right? There's no like the answer is
I see. I will.
Yeah.
Okay.
And HTML, JavaScript, and URL encoder take that, so they're locked.
So it seems like we have beaten that horse to death. I mean, I just took the notes. I mean, it's something that you probably should talk offline what to do with it. But I mean, the general gist was essentially types are mutable. Do we want this? Then there's the efficiency argument, and then there's the chaining argument that you.
I mean, what I can do is first some of this input. I think it's like I'm gonna just remove the is character allowed. For the other questions, I will do some like thinking and write up something.
Yeah.
Like even if it's like lightweight design of what it would look like if it was immutable.
That makes sense.
I have a general naming question. Should we call it code point filter versus like code point setter or something along those lines? Filter, I had to go look through the code to figure out like really what was filtering here. I'm not quite sure what was happening.
So I suggested this when we were discussing the APIs. The feeling was that filter conveys a bit more that it's allowed or disallowed. Set would be like, what would the methods on a set be? Would be like add and remove.
Oh, you're right now. You're only exposing the allowed set. You're computing the inverse, basically, to get the disallowed set, which is basically a set.
Which just seems.
Yeah. Well, look at the code. If you have easy access to the code sample, today the code sample is like super clear what's going on. The one that does the filtering.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't really.
It's like you create a filter and you say allow this range. If it was a set, it would be.
Well, technically, you could say the set is you have add or remove semantics. You just have to.
You call them allow and forbid.
Exactly.
Right.
My only problem with the set would be it's not clear whether it's a whitelist or a blacklist. If it's a filter, and you specifically call allow.
I like it better as filter.
I actually think it's easier to reason about that.
I couldn't figure out how forbid worked with this. Actually, I was trying to understand how I was keeping in context to all you can get is the allowed set. So I was like, how are you computing the forbidden set? I'm not quite.
Unless it's allowed,
everything starts off forbidden, and then if you allow something,
Is that what? That's not.
I'm
true.
guessing.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
tell me if I'm
So
wrong.
the scenario that we had was we had a customer come to us and they said, we want to allow US ASCII except for exclamation point, asterisk, and open and close parens.
Yeah.
So their sequence of operations would be code point filter, Unicode range, basic Latin, forbid characters, and then pass in a string containing those.
Is it really forbidden, or is it removed from the set you've already basically created?
So when we designed this, we called it forbid just because it was a little bit clearer as to what the semantic was.
But you're conceptually building a whitelist.
Yes, you're conceptually building a whitelist.
2 questions. First question is forbid the right prefix over something like deny? I just don't know what is common across the framework.
We have deny
And then the second question is the overloads that take a string. Why do we have them when we have the params char characters thing?
I think it was supposed to be a little bit easier to just pass in a string that contains your forbidden characters rather than saying, okay, single quote, bang, and single quote, comma, space, single quote, asterisk.
One thing that worries me is that I can put, non-UTF-16, I can put things that aren't UTF-16 code units in a string, right? I can have a surrogate pair, and what is this thing going to do there?
Right now, nothing, because surrogates are always forbidden anyway.
But that's probably that's gonna be a problem, right?
Going forward, maybe.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird actually that this thing is called code point filter, but I can't give it code points.
I want to look at it.
Yeah.
No, you can't give it. You can't give it. Well, so right now the problem is that the implementation doesn't look at anything outside the basic multilingual plane.
Yes.
So this is the implementation leaking through, and it's something that I want to look at.
Agreed. Okay.
A character is a Unicode code point. It is defined to be a Unicode code point.
No, when we said earlier, characters char. Char is not a char. Is it's 2 bytes.
Which is a Unicode code point, separate from a scalar.
Sure, but it's not all of the things that I might want to allow through. It's like why what do I want to allow this emoji through or not? Or can I do that?
Yeah, we need to look at
The
that.
implementation doesn't allow you to today, and it's something that we should fix as probably as part of pulling this and the Unicode ranges out of here, or at least when I look at this, that's one of the things I want to investigate.
I think honestly, if you go with, I think I will probably change allow and forbid to include exclude. I think it's more common.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what happens if I call it forbid before I actually add anything to it. Is it moving anything? Is it empty from an empty set kind of thing?
The order of
naming
operations
won't
matters.
change it.
Yeah.
I was going back to whether or not we filter versus set kind of thing.
Everything starts off with everything forbidden. Then you can allow some stuff. Then you can
But
forbid.
if you do the normal collection of things you call remove, you remove something from an empty list, you know you're building it up as a list of a set or something.
These are conceptually add remove, you're right.
But add remove again there's the polarity here is like, then are we adding to a like the list of things that we don't want or the things that we do want?
Yeah.
Whereas allow deny is like allow things through. I like the allow deny or allow forbid personally.
Honestly, I think that we should either go all the way and create basically code point set, and it has methods add and remove, or leave it as is. I don't think like the hybrid in the middle, where it's neither the very clear names that are specific to the encoding APIs, which today that's how it is, nor the very general purpose type that is the set of code points. I think in the middle doesn't make sense. We could go to either of the extremes, I think. But I did suggest the extreme of let's just create a type that represents a set of code points, and the feeling was that the usage would be not as clear, and because it's a security sensitive API, like if you make a mistake, it can have very severe repercussions. They convinced me to leave it as.
If we're looking at it, we might want to consider just putting the word allowed in the type name too, or something to make it clear that this is what it's building a list for.
Allowed code points, and then you add and remove to the allow list.
Yeah, and then you can forbid from now on. Something to make it a little clearer.
Makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's
I do think we use deny like in ACLs and then in code access security for its
We do, and then when you call allow after that, it overrides the deny.
Two things we're like trying to distance ourselves.
I know, but if we're gonna have it, I can't think of any other place where. We
Right.
have-
what's the blessed word in FXCAP?
Clearly not whitelist or
I don't
blacklist.
think-
Don't-
you
Did
don't
you
think-
work on FXCAP at some point?
Yeah, didn't you?
Blessed and unblessed.
Blessed and unblessed.
It's like, yes.
All right.
The other last comment I had was whether or not if we're going to have the separate Unicode the namespace, do the code page go in that? Does it get joined together with the Unicode ranges if we're going to have those two?
You mean this type in particular?
You need to think more about whether this is like just something that lets you do fast set tests on code points, or if this is like actually a thing of like, it's like actually filters for we should do this or not, right? Like, because some of the naming depends on like what you want to, like, so I think when I look at Unicode range and ranges
Which
with,
still doesn't get to my point, which is I want to remove I code point filter.
I actually added the note and just said, why do we need this?
In my
Why do we
opinion.
need this? So. that's
Oh, you
all.
said that?
I added it.
for DI, like, is it for some DI thing or like what is it for?
I think DIing the encoders makes sense. DIing the filters for the encoders,
that
they should
doesn't make
be
sense.
like.
The idea is that the filter you create during your application's initialization phase, and then you pass it in to the constructor, and they maybe put those into the DI system as a result.
So the thing is that if you get rid of the interface here, you're still going to have this get allowed code point method, or
You're gonna have what?
do you still have the IEnumerable get allowed code points method, or
Yeah,
it would come
you
down.
just get rid of the
Yeah.
interface and then you
Yeah.
change the copy?
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. Thank you guys. I will upload the notes and then I will let you guys read it to make sure it's accurate. All right. Thanks guys online.
Thanks.